Our tale opens with a young woman driving down a road in her car. Before long, she becomes aware that a second vehicle is now tailing her. Slowly, a sense of dread starts building within her. Soon, she is certain the car will approach her, with the intent to murder her someplace isolated. She then pulls over and approaches a nearby home, hoping to get assistance. However, the front door of the residence remains shut. At this sight, the frightened girl begins sprinting away. She is currently heading in the direction of the hill. The man continues to pursue her. Once the young woman is out of his sight, the man produces a flashlight to locate her. Eventually, the woman makes it to a main highway. She spots a large truck approaching in the distance. Consequently, she positions herself on the road to signal for assistance. As it gets nearer, the truck comes to a stop. The following day, our attention shifts to a sheriff heading to work. His superior officer informs him about a required trip to Los Angeles. Some very crucial evidence is located there. Your job is to gather every piece of evidence and return with it. This particular sheriff is named Joe. Joe accepts the assignment. He stops by his home prior to departing for Los Angeles. Immediately upon his arrival, he checks in with the forensics department. He then proceeds to retrieve the evidence. The official on duty explains that the evidence is extremely sensitive material. I require signatures from your superiors. Only then can I release this evidence into your custody. Hearing this statement, Joe becomes caught up in this new predicament. He had to procure the required signatures somehow. A lot of Joe's former colleagues are employed at this police station. He decides to pay them a visit. As he greets each of them individually, they are all clearly delighted. His friends insist that Joe should remain with them for the evening. This way, they could all reminisce about the good old days. Joe agrees to stay for some time. While he is seated indoors, a detective from this precinct approaches them. He introduces himself as Jim Baxter. Jim initiates conversation upon noticing Joe. He tells Joe, "I've heard many things about your work. I'm curious to learn what is fact and what is fiction. A homicide has occurred in the vicinity. I am heading over to the scene immediately. I would like you to accompany me. I suspect I could use your particular expertise on something." Joe then consents to go. The two men arrive at the location. Officers are scattered everywhere. Patches of blood are visible on the floor, which everyone is inspecting intently. As Jim observes this, he comments that this detail is quite odd, and so is the murderer. The bloodstains are on the floor. This indicates the woman was murdered right here. So why is her corpse now lying on the bed? Ultimately, what reason would someone have for this? A murderer wants to flee after the act, not create more work. What made him lift the corpse and place it onto the bed? Having observed all these details, Joe is deep in thought. This is because he has witnessed similar scenes previously. He suspects that the crimes that occurred back in his own town, these new crimes are somehow connected, or the murderer is the very same person. Joe departs from that place and walks toward the building opposite, and he looks up at a room there. He can see a chair inside. He then sits down on it, and as he peers out through the window, he begins to see the victim's body. This suggests the murderer is a psychopath. His victims are young women. Afterward, he positions the body in a specific location, a spot from which he can continue to watch them. He is aware the authorities will not visit the opposite building, and in the meantime, he can continue observing the corpse. Joe now fully comprehends these things, that this particular murderer is likely the same one who once operated in his own town. Everyone then returns to their respective homes. The moment that daylight breaks, we witness a young woman sprinting. A man is pursuing her in his vehicle. Joe arrives at the police headquarters once more. He then finds Jim. Jim informs him another killing occurred last evening. "I need you to remain here. Your presence would be a great help." Joe begins to consider this request. He initially visits the medical examiner, the one performing the post-mortem on the victim, the woman who was killed in the early morning. One by one, Joe starts to pose questions. The medical examiner responds to him with ease. We then learn that the two of them have met before. Joe poses a series of inquiries. At this point, the doctor pauses. She says, "Joe, I am aware of your entire history. Several years back, you attempted to crack a very similar case, but you were unable to apprehend the culprit, and as a direct result, your entire life fell apart. I will not let you destroy your life once again over this." However, Joe is unable to do so. He urges the medical examiner to assist him. She finally agrees to help him, and then goes out. Once she leaves, Joe begins speaking to the deceased woman. He says that one should choose their company very carefully, and most particularly when you decide to invite them into your home. You welcome the incorrect individual into your residence. Look at the result of what he did. After uttering this, as he emerges, the medical examiner hands him the key to the victim's home. This allows him to enter the residence to search for additional evidence. And Joe soon arrives inside the dwelling. He examines his surroundings with great attention and returns to his own place. Later on, while he is trying to sleep that evening, he then envisions every murdered victim. This indicates that he is having hallucinations. He cannot absolve himself. For every young woman the murderer has taken, Joe feels it is entirely his blame. At dawn, Jim arrives at the precinct. His superior officer confronts him. "Did you request that Joe remain here?" Jim confirms it. His boss then tells him he has made a huge mistake. "You probably are not aware of Joe's past. Just like the murderer active here, there was once a similar predator in his town. He murdered a large number of women." Joe then began to hunt for him. His entire existence became dedicated to the search. His personal life began to completely unravel. Before long, his marriage ended. He later suffered a coronary event. Jim begins to contemplate this. But meanwhile, Joe is already occupied with the case. He puts on a fresh set of clothes. This is so he can avoid wearing his official police attire. He then arrives at a local service center and begins to inquire about their workers. Therefore, Joe requests a complete list of all staff members. He observes that one worker has voided a service call here. He jots down his name and departs the premises. We then catch a glimpse of that worker. He was observing Joe with intense focus. This particular employee is named Albert. Meanwhile, Jim is preoccupied with his own duties. He visits the home of the missing girl, the one who vanished while jogging at dawn. This young woman is called Rhonda. He gathers all the pertinent details from her mother and father about Rhonda's activities. After he has collected all the necessary information, he then departs with a photo of Rhonda. A short time later, he receives word about the discovery of another corpse. Near the edge of the water, Jim arrives on scene. He attempts to identify the victim's face as Rhonda's. However, the victim is a different person. Joe then shows up. Upon seeing Joe, Jim states that the woman was savagely murdered. An individual took a blade and repeatedly plunged it into her until she finally expired. Her demise was extremely agonizing. The two discuss it for hours. Later, Jim invites Joe over for breakfast the next day. Upon meeting Jim's family, Joe feels genuinely happy. Jim has a wonderful home life. He has young daughters in his household. They approach Joe inquisitively. Joe remarks that the children are absolutely adorable. When you see kids like these, all your troubles just melt away. They depart from there and find a tavern. Joe is having a drink. Jim then briefs him completely on the investigation. He explains that 6 women are dead to date. One of the victims' corpses was discovered inside her home, but the place she was murdered, she was moved from that spot. The remaining victims were slain in other locations, and their remains were all discovered somewhere else. There is just a single commonality among the 6 victims. All 6 of these women worked as prostitutes, but I cannot comprehend the murderer's motive for these actions. After murdering the women, why does he transport their bodies? Upon hearing these details, Joe suggests that he enjoys being on the road, and he is committing these acts deliberately. Jim then questions him. Why does this case mean so much to you? Hearing this question, Joe becomes quiet. He drives Jim to the outskirts of town. He points to a rock and speaks. I discovered 3 victims in this spot. Observing the corpses, it appeared as if they were posed. Each one of those 3 women were blameless. I worked very hard to capture the murderer, but back then I was unable to apprehend the culprit. However, now I am giving it my all. I refuse to let another person die. Having said this, he proceeds to the home of that specific individual, the one whose address he obtained from the service center, namely, Albert's home. He arrives and inspects Albert's vehicle. He checks the mileage on the car's odometer. He then notices Albert exiting his house. Once outside, Albert tosses his trash into the garbage can and then departs. Joe then retrieves the garbage for himself. He discovers that a slice of pizza is sitting right inside. He then takes the pizza slice directly to the forensics division. He instructs the technician working there to measure the dimensions of the bite mark. Does this item correspond with the previous victim? The forensics expert, after a complete examination, confirms that the most recent victim we recovered. This mark corresponds with that woman's bite pattern. It is also a possibility this victim consumed this pizza. Joe then begins to tail Albert. He surveils him around the clock. One evening, Joe spots Albert picking up some takeout. Soon after, Albert meets with a sex worker and leads her to his vehicle. A sudden realization hits Joe. All the victims in the recent murders were sex workers. The next day, while tailing Albert, Joe sees his vehicle parked in a secluded spot. After observing for a moment, he immediately calls Jim and reports what he's witnessed. Jim reacts with urgency. That location isn't just random. A woman's body was recently discovered there. Joe is now convinced Albert is the killer. He orders the entire unit to move in, raid Albert's home, and take him into custody. The authorities follow through, bringing Albert in for questioning. One by one, photos of all the murdered women are laid out in front of him. Any ordinary person would struggle to look at them, but not Albert. He chuckles, then casually remarks on the killer's impressive craftsmanship. Joe loses his temper and attacks Albert. The officers quickly restrain him. There's no solid evidence, and this kind of action could ruin the case. With no grounds to hold him, they release Albert. The next day, a young woman named Tina comes forward. It's revealed that she is the same woman who managed to escape the killer in the film's opening scene. After hearing her full story, the detectives show her a photo lineup, including a picture of Albert. Tina hesitates. She's unsure. It might be him, she says, but I need to see him in person to know for sure. Upon hearing this, Jim rushes out. Tension is building. Everyone believes Albert is the killer. Jim's superior calls him in and gives him a clear ultimatum. Capture the killer in 3 days, or the FBI takes over the case. Jim tries to explain. We have a witness and a person of interest. But the superior just laughs. He warns Jim, Albert is playing you. He pulled this same stunt years ago, came in claiming he was a murderer, that he'd killed someone. But when we investigated, he wasn't even in town at the time. The guy just enjoys messing with officers. Stop wasting time on him, he adds. Focus on finding the real killer, or you're off the case. Jim relays everything to Joe. With only 2 days left, they know they have to act fast. Joe insists there's only one move left. They must search Albert's house, secretly. If they ask the department, they'll never get a warrant. They'll have to break in, quietly, under cover of night. They wait outside Albert's home until he leaves. Once the coast is clear, Joe sneaks in and begins searching. At first, he finds nothing. But then, he accidentally kicks a container. Inside are dozens of newspaper clippings, every article detailing the murdered women. Albert has carefully kept them all. This suggests he's not just following the case, he's obsessed with it. Meanwhile, as officers arrive, Joe escapes to the rooftop, trying to avoid being caught. Albert soon shows up and offers Joe a handshake, a mocking gesture that reveals just how much he's enjoying their desperation. Later, Joe meets with Jim. Jim asks if he found anything, specifically, a red hair clip that belonged to Rhonda, one of the victims. Her parents said she always wore it. Joe replies, no. I would have kept looking, but the cops showed up. After parting ways, Jim heads to a payphone and calls his wife. While he's talking, Albert appears out of nowhere and startles him from behind. Now completely consumed by rage, Jim points his pistol at Albert and shows him a photo of Rhonda. Tell me where this girl is, he demands. Albert remains calm. I can take you to her. Follow me. Without hesitation, Jim forces Albert into the car. As they drive, Albert directs him further and further out of town. Joe happens to spot them leaving the city limits. Suspicious, he begins following at a distance. Eventually, Jim and Albert arrive at a barren, desolate wasteland, miles away from civilization. Albert tells him to stop the car. Jim steps out. Albert stays still, then gestures to the ground. Right where you're standing, Rhonda might be buried there. He hands Jim a shovel. Jim starts digging. He digs for a long time, but nothing is found. Maybe I was wrong, Albert says, smirking. She might be over there. Jim moves and starts digging again. Still nothing. Maybe I made another mistake, Albert mocks. Try over there. And so it continues. Jim, exhausted and furious, keeps digging hole after hole, while Albert watches, visibly entertained. Albert isn't just playing games, he's enjoying the torment. He's a sadist, a psychopath, and he takes special pleasure in breaking law enforcement. At Jim's breaking point, Albert makes a chilling comment. I saw the photo of your family, your wife, your 2 little girls. Adorable. It would be a real shame if something happened to them, and you couldn't stop it. That's it. Jim snaps. He strikes Albert hard with his pistol. Albert falls to the ground and doesn't get back up. He's dead. Jim just killed a man. And worse, there's no solid proof Albert was the murderer. The weight of what he's done crashes down on him. He sinks to the ground, overwhelmed. Joe arrives soon after and sees Albert's lifeless body. He immediately understands what's happened. The story then shifts into a flashback. Joe remembers a terrible mistake from his own past. Years ago, while working in this very region, he investigated the disappearance of several young women. He eventually found 2 of the missing girls, dead, lying on some rocks in the forest. Then he heard movement in the bushes. Reacting instinctively, Joe fired his weapon. But it wasn't the killer. It was the 3rd missing girl. His fellow officers witnessed everything. But to protect Joe's career, they covered it up. Now, Joe sees the same thing happening to Jim, and he's determined to shield him from the same fate. He approaches Jim and says calmly, "You never saw Albert. You were never here." Then he instructs Jim to leave his vehicle and walk away. Jim obeys, confused and broken. Joe climbs into Albert's car and drives off. He later sells the vehicle to some local criminals, making sure it disappears. Then he breaks into Albert's house, collects all of his belongings, and loads them into his own vehicle. Back at the wasteland, Joe buries the body himself. Time passes. No one is looking for Albert. No one files a report. He simply vanishes. But Jim begins to fall apart. The guilt eats away at him day by day. He believes he killed an innocent man. Then, one day, a package arrives at his doorstep. It's from Joe. Inside, there's a red hair clip, the same one Rhonda's parents had described. Along with it, a note. "I found this among Albert's things. Thought you should know." Jim stares at the clip. Relief floods through him. If Albert had Rhonda's clip, then he was the killer. Jim didn't murder an innocent man. He stopped a monster. His conscience begins to heal. Joe has returned to his own town. He burns all of Albert's belongings. As the fire crackles, we see something next to him, a small pack of hair clips. One is missing, the red one. Joe didn't find it in Albert's home. He bought it, just to send to Jim, to give him peace. Because Joe knows what it means to live with unbearable guilt, and he refuses to let Jim suffer the same fate. He's in it his own pursuit of the real killer. Jim believes the case is closed. Albert was the murderer, but in reality, the true killer is still out there. And with that, the story ends.